Hey everyone, and welcome to this explainer. Today we're going to impartially unpack a pretty provocative political science framework from our source material. It's called the dominance execution loop. We're going to explore exactly how analysts attempt to understand, measure, and even anticipate the actions of political figures who just don't seem to play by traditional institutional rules. It is a fascinating look into the actual mechanics of power.
So here's our roadmap for today. We'll cover the loop itself, look at how it explains the past, how it forecasts the future, we'll rate the model, and then finally look at modeling the now. Let's jump right in.
But look, before we get into the weeds of the analysis, we really have to ask the big core question raised by our source text. Is it actually possible for an algorithm to perfectly predict how a political executive will behave? Can messy human political maneuvering truly be boiled down to a repeatable equation? Well, let's find out.
All right, Section 1, the dominance execution loop. The source document uses this theoretical framework to analyze a specific U.S. presidency. Our text evaluates the core premise of this model, which it dubs the Trump Chapter 11 thesis, and it essentially frames executive actions not as your standard run-of-the-mill political policymaking, but as a systematic, highly legalistic strategy. It's kind of like a corporate bankruptcy. Imagine a CEO taking over a rival company, stripping it of its assets, and just completely neutralizing any internal resistance, all driven by this unbounded pursuit of dominance. The framework is arguing that this isn't just random chaos, it's a specific, ruthless methodology being applied to the state itself.
Moving right along to Section 2, explaining the past through retrodiction analysis. To figure out how powerful this model really is, the text analyzes a super bold claim that this framework scores a perfect 10 out of 10 in something called retrodiction.
If you aren't familiar with that term, our source breaks it down perfectly. Unlike predicting the future, retrodiction means looking back at a set of known, past outcomes and making logical sense of them through a specific, structured lens. It's basically connecting the dots after the drawing is already finished.
And the claim analyzed in the text gives the model a 10 out of 10 for this. Why such a stellar score? Because according to the framework's proponents, it seemingly provides a unified theory for a bunch of completely disparate events. Think about it. It takes actions that might otherwise look totally disconnected, like rhetorical attacks on the press, the sudden use of emergency powers or pushes for absolute immunity, and it ties them all to one single, overriding objective, the systematic dismantling of checks and balances.
But maintaining strict neutrality here, our source acts as the grader and pumps the brakes a bit. It notes that while the model internally tells a really coherent story about escalation, giving it a perfect 10 out of 10 ignores some massive blind spots. Most notably, the model suffers from a high risk of confirmation bias. I mean, if you assume every single action is a play for total dominance, you're going to see dominance in every action, right? You end up ignoring basic things like bureaucratic incompetence or regular external pressures. The text warns that the model reduces incredibly complex political realities down to a single ideologically loaded driver.
Okay, so if it's a powerful, albeit somewhat flawed lens for looking backward, we move to Section 3, forecasting the future, to test its predictive power.
The text emphasizes a really crucial difference here between retrodiction and prediction. It is one thing to neatly map out historical data when you already know how the story ends. It is an entirely different beast to successfully forecast future behavior in a highly dynamic, wildly complex political system filled with variables that literally no one can control.
The model actually tries to do this, though, through a roadmap it calls sequential neutralization. Borrowing heavily from that bankruptcy metaphor again, it outlines a chronological timeline. It predicts that an executive will first target unsecured creditors, meaning the media and the press, before systematically moving on to much harder targets, the secured creditors, like the judiciary, the FBI, and eventually all the way down to state-level powers. It provides a very distinct vector of attack.
But, and this is a big but, the text explicitly warns against treating this like a crystal ball. The crucial takeaway here is that while it might predict the general direction of an attack, it absolutely cannot predict the specific tactic that'll be used. For instance, the model can't predict novel exogenous shocks, think a global pandemic. It also risks creating a self-fulfilling prophecy. If political opponents assume the executive is making an autocratic power grab, well, they might break norms themselves just to stop it, which ironically provides the executive with the exact justification they needed to escalate even further. It becomes a really messy feedback loop.
So, moving past those initial claims of absolute perfection, how does the source document officially grade this whole thing? Let's look at Section 4, rating the model.
When the author strips away the hype and evaluates this strictly as an academic theoretical model in political science, that perfect 10 drops down to a solid 8 out of 10. Now, an 8 is still really good, and it earns that score because it actually outshines a lot of standard political models. Take traditional rational choice models, for example. They completely fail when a leader makes seemingly irrational, self-destructive choices. But this model? It explains that exact behavior as a highly rational pursuit of unbounded dominance. It also goes way beyond mere psychodynamics. It doesn't just say a leader is driven by ego. It maps out the exact institutional methodology they are going to use to satisfy that drive.
Which brings us to a really fascinating twist in Section 5, modeling the now and its real-time application. Because it turns out the true value of this algorithm isn't in debating history or guessing the distant future at all.
When you take this framework and hand it to a real-time analyst as an operational lens to anticipate events exactly as they are unfolding, the evaluation score absolutely skyrockets to a 9.5 out of 10.
It gets this massive score because it essentially decodes the logic of escalation for the analyst in real time. First, the model tells you to monitor for crisis rhetoric. Once a crisis is fabricated or amplified, you immediately move to step 2 and forecast the next pressure point, an assertion of sweeping executive authority. And then, crucially, step 3, if a policy gets blocked in court, the model predicts the actor is not going to compromise or back down. Instead, they'll escalate. They'll use a completely new tactic in a totally different arena just to maintain their offensive momentum. It turns the analyst into a real-time pattern recognition engine.
The source uses a really great analogy here. It says it's exactly like predicting a chess player who is solely focused on capturing the king at all costs. You can't possibly guess every single pawn sacrifice or wild tactical maneuver they're going to make on the board, but by understanding their underlying grammar of action, you know for a fact they will avoid draws, they will attack relentlessly, and you know exactly what kind of storm is coming your way.
And that brings us to one final, pretty heavy question to chew on. If we possess this real-time strategic map of the dominance execution loop, if we can actually see this power capture manual playing out step by step, does knowing the rules of this new game empower institutions to change the outcome? Or, by anticipating and reacting to these moves, are we just helplessly watching the algorithm run its inevitable course, effectively guaranteeing the very escalation it predicts? Definitely something to think about as you observe the political landscape. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the patterns around you.